Today, we are accustomed to seeing emergency exits clearly marked in every public venue we visit and take for granted the system of sprinklers and alarms that hang above us. Sadly, many laws surrounding fire safety often only come into being after fatal accidents. Such was the case with the 1942 Cocoanut Grove fire, which ravaged a Boston supper club, leading to a change in US fire safety laws at the cost of nearly 500 lives. If there was a place to be seen on a Saturday night in Boston in 1942, it was the Cocoanut Grove. Nightclubs did not officially operate in Boston, so the Grove skirted restrictions as a supper club. The business had been around since 1927, built in the narrow, cobbled Piedmont Street near the Park Square Theatre District. The original owners were two men, Mickey Alpert and Jacques Renard, band leaders who had connections to the local mafia, connections that led to the Grove gaining a reputation as a speakeasy during the Prohibition era. These allegations grew stronger in 1931 when ownership was passed to a local mob boss and bootlegger named Charlie Solomon. In 1933, Solomon was indicted for operating an illegal liquor smuggling ring, but before legal proceedings could begin, he was gunned down in a man's restroom. Ownership of the Grove then passed to his lawyer, Barney Wolanski. Despite being a step removed from the mafia, it's said that Wolanski would often boast about his gangland connections and the fact he had the ear of Mayor Morris J. Tobin. By this point, the Cocoanut Grove had evolved into a sprawling complex. On the main floor, a large dining room and ballroom greeted visitors. A bandstand gleamed with several bars flanking this main area. The dining room featured a retractable roof for use during the steamy Boston summer. Around a corner and down a stairway, the basement contained the Melody Lounge, a dimly lit bar that hosted piano players, comedy acts, and other entertainment. In the basement were also the kitchen, freezers, and storage areas. The interior of the Grove was designed to transport its guests to the South Pacific. Leatherette, rattan, and bamboo disguised walls. Heavy draperies and dark blue satin canopies clung to the ceiling. Support columns were made to look like palm trees. Light fixtures were hidden within coconuts. All materials used to disguise the squat brick building as a tropical oasis were effective as decor, but a nightmare for fire prevention. On Saturday, November 28, 1942, Boston College's football team was trounced in a home game upset by Holy Cross College. Following the 55-12 defeat at Fenway Park, the celebration party scheduled at the Grove was cancelled. This was only a minor setback for the Grove, however, as it had no problem attracting patrons. Hollywood Western star Buck Jones was persuaded by his agent to have dinner at the Grove after attending the game with Boston Mayor Morris Tobin. Jones wasn't feeling well and had been hoping for a quiet night alone. Still, he reluctantly entered the revolving door on Piedmont Street and climbed the raised platform reserved for celebrity diners after the maitre d' announced him. In the dining room, patrons were crowded around small tables awaiting the start of the 10 o'clock show. The Melody Lounge downstairs was full too, the waitstaff rushing to serve more than 1,000 diners and revelers. Pianist Goody Goodell took to the Melody Lounge stage and began to play. As she did so, a young man at one of the tables decided he and his date would like a little more privacy, so unscrewed a bulb in the coconut light fixture above where they were seated. Moments later, a 16-year-old busboy named Stanley Tomaszewski, rushing to clear glasses in the lounge, was ordered by a bartender to fix the light, which was affixed to the top of an artificial palm tree. As he set about doing as he was told, the busboy lit a match to see what he was doing, tightened the bulb and stomped the matchstick beneath his foot before returning to work. Moments later, patrons noticed the flicker of flames in the fronds of the palm tree, which quickly began to take hold. Bartenders jumped into action, dousing the fire with water and seltzer bottles, but to no avail. In an effort to stop the fire from spreading to the fabric-covered ceiling, the tree was pulled over, but it was already too late. From that flaming corner in the basement, the closest public exit was atop a 4-foot wide set of stairs leading to the foyer on the first floor. Some patrons made a rush towards the stairs. Others sat dumbstruck as the fire climbed across the furniture, igniting a fireball that spewed flames and toxic gas that barreled towards the stairway. After singeing the hair off the heads of the patrons fumbling in the stairwell, the fireball burst onto the main floor foyer area. Cries of fire, fire filled the air and panic ensued. Patrons flooded the revolving door, which became jammed with bodies. Observers on the street watched as those within were crushed by the weight of the crowd surging against the door. Inside the Grove, the fire had spread to the dining room and raced through the adjacent caricature bar, down a corridor to the Broadway lounge, and across the dance floor as the orchestra was beginning its show. Another factor aiding the fire's spread was the fact that due to shortages of the refrigerant Freon, the air conditioning system was instead using highly flammable methyl chloride as a coolant. Many of those inside the Grove were overcome with flames and smoke inhalation before they could even leave their seats. More scrambled toward the exit on a wave of terror, the fire moving faster than they could run. Sadly, for most, it was futile. There was nowhere to run to. In an effort to stop people leaving without paying, Barney Wolanski had seen to it that all other exits were either concealed, locked, or even bricked up entirely. A plate glass window had also recently been boarded up, blocking that from becoming a potential escape route. In the Broadway lounge, an exit door was unlocked, but only opened inwards, useless against the crush of people clawing at it to escape. Employees who knew where the hidden staff-only exits were shouted for guests to follow them down corridors to their escapes. In desperation, some patrons even hid in the freezers. The Boston Fire Department was nearby, extinguishing an automobile fire on Stewart Street at 10:15 when they noticed smoke coming from the club 3 blocks away. They moved to investigate and were met by frantic bystanders running towards them to report the incident. They found smoke pouring from every opening, with a slow stream of patrons escaping from what few exits they could find. By this point, many people from surrounding night spots had arrived on the scene and were attempting to help any way they could, many of them being soldiers and sailors. By 11:02, the fire chief had issued 5 alarms. The blaze was extinguished quickly, but it was still too late for hundreds. Stacks of bodies, some living and some dead, were piled shoulder high at the exits. Inside, the charred remains of diners were strewn everywhere. Those that had managed to get outside were now met by freezing November temperatures. After going from one extreme to another, once they took a breath of cold air, they were said to have dropped like stones. Inside the building, firefighters found the severely burned body of Buck Jones under his table. They also discovered the bodies of several patrons still sat at their tables with drinks in hand. So fast were the fumes and the flames. At the time of the Cocoanut Grove fire, owner Wolanski was recovering from a heart attack he had suffered 12 days earlier in a bed at Massachusetts General Hospital. Downstairs, over 100 victims from the fire that had ravaged his club poured into the lobby. Another 300 were taken to Boston City Hospital. A temporary morgue was set up in a garage near the Grove, and staff and volunteers began the arduous process of attempting to identify bodies. Occasionally, they stumbled across one still breathing and rushed them to the hospital. The massive need for medical treatment forced personnel to adopt new care methods. Burns victims from the disaster were some of the first to be treated with penicillin to fight infections as part of their recovery. They coated skin in boric petroleum and stitched skin grafts. Experience from treating the Cocoanut Grove victims would also lead to the publication of the Lund and Browder chart, a tool used to estimate the total body surface area affected by burns, which is still used to this day. Sadly, many victims who appeared to escape the worst of it succumbed to pulmonary edema caused by breathing toxic smoke and gases from the burned furnishings. Others would spend years in hospital, but thankfully all medical bills were waived thanks to donations by the Red Cross. By the time the figurative and literal smoke had settled about the Grove, 492 people were dead, with another 166 injured. In the horrific aftermath, investigations were launched, resulting in a grand jury indictment of 10 people. In the end, though, only Wolanski was convicted on 19 counts of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 12 to 15 years in prison in 1943. 3 years later, he was pardoned by Morris J. Tobin, who was now governor of Massachusetts. 9 weeks later, however, he succumbed to cancer. Building codes were amended in Boston and other cities. Revolving doors were outlawed for a time before being reinstated with the requisite that they had to be flanked by 2 outward opening exit doors. Flammable decorations and inward swinging emergency exits were also banned as part of a raft of new safety laws. Today, a hotel now sits on the land where the Cocoanut Grove once was. The streets in the area have been altered, and the location of the Grove's revolving door now houses the intersection of Piedmont and Shawmut Street. A bronze plaque placed on the brick sidewalk nearby by the Bay Village Neighborhood Association in 1993 shows a diagram of the old club, the narrow corridors that ended in locked doors, the artificial palm trees that became pillars of flame. It reads, "In memory of the more than 490 people who died as a result of the Cocoanut Grove fire on November 28, 1942. As a result of this terrible tragedy, major changes were made in the fire codes and improvements in the treatment of burn victims not only in Boston, but across the nation." At the bottom of the plaque is the phrase, "Phoenix out of the ashes." Before we leave, I'd like to share the story of a tragedy within the tragedy. One of the survivors that night was a man named Clifford Johnson. He had made it out of the burning building, but made his way back in several times in search of his date, who he had lost sight of. Unbeknownst to him, she had already made it out. The Coast Guardsman suffered over 55% burns to his body and spent over a year in hospital, becoming the most severely burned person to survive their wounds at that moment in time. He would go on to marry his nurse, with the pair eventually moving to Missouri. There, Clifford got a job as a fuel delivery driver, and tragically, on December the 20th, 1956, 14 years after surviving the Cocoanut Grove disaster, Johnson would perish when his vehicle crashed and burst into flame. A tragic reminder that life is very fragile. Thank you for watching. Please take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, "Well, I never."